When I first began researching the mass removal of church bells during the First World War, I assumed the explanation would be simple. War needs metal. Bells are bronze. Governments confiscated them. That is the story repeated in the textbooks. But the deeper I went into the records, the faster that explanation began to fall apart. Because what disappeared in 1914 was not just metal, it was infrastructure. For centuries, bells had regulated daily life. They marked the time before clocks were common. They coordinated work, warnings, gatherings, and emergencies. Whole towns were synchronized by sound. So when the bells were taken, communities did not just lose objects, they lost a system. And the first thing that stood out was how uniform the removals were. Across Europe, even across enemy nations, the same orders appeared at the same time. France, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Italy. Different governments, different languages, identical action, and the bells were not ripped down and thrown on a scrap heap. They were lowered carefully, documented, transported intact, which is strange, because if urgency was the goal, preservation makes no sense. If you need bronze for shells today, you break the bell where it hangs and you melt it. You do not catalogue it and ship it somewhere to sit. I'm Julian Crane, an archaeologist the establishment pushed out when I started asking the questions my colleagues wouldn't. So on this channel, I dig up the history they left out. If that's the sort of thing you want more of, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind later. Now let's get into the terrifying reason thousands of church bells disappeared around 1914 and why the story we were told about them does not survive contact with the record. Start with the first anomaly, because it is the one that unraveled everything else for me. The bells were not melted right away, they were stored. As I combed through municipal archives and wartime photographs, the same images kept appearing across regions. Rows of bells stacked in open fields, lined up beside rail lines, catalogued and numbered. These were not scrap piles, they were organized inventories. And if the goal was to turn bells into weapons, why pause the process? Why haul them long distances only to leave them untouched? Then comes the silence in the record. After the war, Europe rebuilt aggressively. Churches were restored, monuments reconstructed, civic symbols returned, but the bells did not come back. There were no comprehensive replacement programs, no public audits, no explanations for why entire regions stayed silent. The documentation simply ends, and that absence became impossible to ignore because governments track metal, they track wartime resources, they track losses down to the kilogram. Yet in this case the story stops halfway through. Bells are removed, bells are stored, and then nothing. No confirmation of melting, no matching foundry output, no final accounting. Which leads to the question that started this whole investigation. If this was only about metal, why were the bells never returned? Move from the written records to the physical evidence, because written records can be incomplete, but photographs are harder to dismiss. The first image that stopped me came from a regional archive in Central Europe. An open field, flat land, rail lines nearby, and stretching across the frame, bells, not one or two, dozens, then hundreds, stacked carefully on wooden supports, arranged in rows, each one upright, each one undamaged. This was not chaos, it was storage. And as I kept searching, the same scene appeared again and again. Different countries, different years, the same layout, bell fields, some photographed beside rail yards, others near military depots, a few near foundries, but never inside them. And that distinction matters, because scrap metal does not get stored like this. Scrap is piled, broken, sorted by weight. These bells were intact. More than that, many still bore their identification marks, catalogue numbers, town names, foundry stamps. In several photographs the markings are clearly visible, which means someone intended to keep track of them. And that forced me to stop assuming destruction was the goal, because you do not catalogue something you are about to erase. Look at what the photographs actually show. The bell fields sit beside rail yards and near military depots and sometimes near foundries, but the bells are outside the foundries, not inside them. They are lined up on wooden supports so the bronze does not touch the wet ground. They are spaced, ordered, numbered. That is not how you treat a raw material you are hours away from melting. That is how you treat an inventory you intend to keep, or move, or account for later. A scrapyard is chaos by design, because the shape of the object no longer matters, only its weight. A bell field is the opposite. Every object still has its identity, its stamp, its number, its town. Someone went to real trouble to make sure that when these bells came down, you could still tell exactly which bell was which and where it had hung. You only do that when the individual bell, and not just the bronze in it, is the thing that matters. I began cross-referencing the images against municipal inventories. Many towns had kept pre-war bell registries listing weights, dimensions, and casting dates. Those registries confirmed the removals, but when I followed the trail forward, something broke. There were no matching foundry receipts, no records of alloy breakdown, no spike in bronze output corresponding to the number of bells taken. The wartime production logs list shells, casings, and artillery components, but not bells, and not in the quantities that should exist if these fields had actually been processed. In some regions, hundreds of bells vanish from the records entirely. Not destroyed, not repurposed, just absent. And what makes it more unsettling is the effort involved. These bells were massive. Some weighed several tons. Moving them required cranes, rail cars, and dozens of workers. That level of coordination does not happen by accident. So why go through all of it only to stop? Official historians tend to explain this away as wartime confusion. But confusion does not create patterns, and these patterns were precise. The same handling methods, the same storage layouts, the same lack of follow-through across borders, across years, across political systems. The problem was never that the bells were taken. The problem is that their story ends too early, because destruction leaves evidence, and silence on this scale does not happen by accident. Which brings me to the bells themselves, because once you stop looking at them as religious symbols and start looking at them as engineered objects, another layer appears. Bells are not simple. They are precision instruments. Every large bell is tuned, not to a single note, but to a complex harmonic profile, a fundamental tone, overtones, subharmonics. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, bell casting was treated as applied science. Foundry records describe exact ratios. Wall thickness variations measured in millimeters, profiles adjusted to control the way the vibration decays. This was not folklore, it was engineering. And what struck me most was the consistency. Across Europe, bells from entirely different regions share similar proportions, similar tonal ranges, similar mass to diameter ratios. That does not happen by accident. It suggests a shared design logic, a common standard that nobody has fully explained. Think about what that consistency actually implies. A bell in a French village and a bell in a Hungarian one, cast in different centuries by different founders who never met, who spoke no common language, who were not working from any published international standard, come out of the mold with the same proportions and the same tonal range. Craft traditions do not usually converge like that. They drift, they develop local quirks, regional signatures, the fingerprint of a particular workshop. But the great bells do not drift the way you would expect. They hold to something, as if the founders were all reproducing a form they had inherited rather than inventing one, working to a specification whose origin none of them could have told you. That is the same pattern you find everywhere in this larger story. A finished design, arriving fully formed, with no visible history of trial and error behind it. Then I began looking at placement, and the placement is where it stops feeling like coincidence. Bells were not positioned randomly in a town. They were elevated, centered, aligned with open space. Bell towers were often the highest non-defensive structures in a settlement, placed to maximize their range, placed to overlap with the range of neighboring towers. And when you map them, many of these towers form repeating distance patterns. Not a perfect grid, but a rhythmic spacing, as if coverage was the point. Historical accounts describe bells rung at specific times, and not only for worship, for daily regulation, work cycles, market openings, warnings, weather changes, even illness. In several regions, the records mention bells rung during outbreaks, during storms, during periods people described as bad air. That phrase appears again and again, bad air. Before germ theory, people understood their environment through sensation, smell, sound, pressure, and bells were believed to influence that environment. Today we dismiss that as superstition. But modern science complicates the dismissal because sound is mechanical energy. Vibration travels through air, through stone, through water, and through the human body. Low-frequency resonance can travel for kilometers. It can influence materials, it can affect biological systems. That is not speculation, that is physics. And large bronze bells produce powerful, sustained vibrations, especially when rung repeatedly, and especially when tuned in relation to one another. Hold those two facts together for a moment. A field of low-frequency resonance, generated by tuned instruments, overlapping across a whole region, ringing on a regular schedule for centuries. We know that low-frequency vibration travels through stone and water and flesh. We know it can settle a nervous system or agitate one. We know that modern medicine now uses sound in therapy, that architects tune concert halls to the decimal, that biologists study how vibration affects living tissue. Each of those fields touches one corner of the same truth, that frequency is not decoration, it is mechanism. The people who built these bell networks did not have our vocabulary for any of it. They talked about bad air and warding off sickness and calling the town together. But the effect they were producing was physical and real, whether or not they could explain it, and it covered the entire inhabited landscape, which brings us straight back to the removals, because the bells targeted in 1914 were not chosen at random. The large bells were taken, the old bells, the deep-toned bells. The smaller bells were often left behind. Decorative bells remained. Ceremonial bells survived. But the largest, most resonant instruments were prioritized, and that detail changes everything. If this were about metal alone, weight would matter, but so would speed, and melting on site would be the efficient choice. Instead, these bells were transported intact, stored, and catalogued, almost as if someone did not want them damaged. Almost as if their form mattered as much as their material. And once you consider bells as infrastructure, as part of a larger acoustic system, the logic shifts. Removing them would do far more than silence a few churches. It would dismantle a network that regulated time, coordinated communities, and possibly interacted with the environment in ways we no longer understand. And once that network was gone, it could not easily be rebuilt, because tuning knowledge fades, foundries close, a craft becomes a ritual instead of a science. By the early 20th century, bell making had already changed. Bells had become symbolic again, not systemic, which raises a genuinely disturbing possibility. What if the bells were not removed because they were obsolete, but because they still worked? We are used to the idea that old technology gets retired once something better comes along. But nobody retires a working system and then goes to the trouble of carefully preserving it, cataloguing it, and storing it in a field, and then simply never turns it back on. You do that with something you want out of service, but do not dare destroy. Something you need silenced, but not gone. And a country at war is the one moment in history when you can take down every large bell on the continent at once, in enemy nations and friendly ones alike, and have the entire world nod along, because everyone already knows the story. War needs metal. Nobody asks a second question. It is the perfect cover, and the timing, in 1914, could not have been better if it had been chosen. Follow what happened after they were gone, because the change was not loud. There were no announcements, no declarations that something essential had been removed. Life continued, but the rhythm was gone. When you compare towns before and after 1914, a subtle but consistent shift emerges. Pre-war photographs show cities organized around sound. Bell towers dominate the skylines. Open squares radiate outward from them. Daily life looks synchronized. After the war, those same towers remain, but they are empty, silent. In many cases, they were not rebuilt, not redesigned. simply left hollow. And the municipal records from the 1920s reveal something strange. Cities begin installing mechanical clocks, sirens, factory whistles, artificial signals. Where bells had once regulated communal life organically, these new systems impose time from the outside. Time becomes fragmented, work hours extend, night shifts expand, and the sound itself shifts from something harmonic to something abrasive. This was not only cultural, it was physical. Communities that had lived for centuries inside a regular field of low-frequency resonance suddenly lost it, with no transition and no adjustment. Silence replaced vibration, and at the same time, reports of distinctly modern problems begin to rise in the urban records. Sleep disturbances, anxiety, disorientation, social unrest. None of it is attributed to the bells, of course, but the timing lines up. Another pattern emerges when you look at the architecture. Renovations after 1914 often seal the bell chambers. Access ladders are removed. Open arches are bricked in, and you have to ask, why seal an empty space? Why not just leave it? Unless what mattered was not the bell, but the absence of sound made permanent. Then there is the question of replacement. After the war, so much was restored. Statues returned, libraries rebuilt, paintings recovered, but the bells across whole regions were never replaced. In some towns, bells were promised, funds were allocated, and then nothing. Decades pass, and the silence remains. I found correspondence from local councils requesting new bells well into the 1930s, and the replies are vague, delayed, non-committal, as if no one wanted to reopen the subject. And there is the industrial shift that follows. Once the bells were gone, coal becomes dominant, electric grids expand, centralized power replaces local systems. Sound, once communal and environmental, becomes mechanical and private. Headphones, radios, broadcasts. The shared sonic environment dissolves, and at this point, coincidence becomes hard to maintain. The removal of the bells lines up with centralized timekeeping, with the expansion of industrial labor, with the loss of communal rhythms, with rising environmental noise, and with the decline of harmonic soundscapes. None of that proves intent on its own, but together it points to something deeper than wartime necessity. The world after 1914 is not just louder, it is harsher, more fragmented, less synchronized with itself, and that is what makes the final fact impossible to ignore. Nothing replaced the bells. Not truly. Technology advanced, cities modernized, power grids expanded, but the system the bells belonged to was never restored. And that absence is the last clue, because societies rebuild what they value. Roads are rebuilt, bridges are rebuilt, churches are rebuilt. Even symbols are restored when they matter enough. But a functional system, one that had shaped daily life across an entire continent, was allowed to vanish without resistance. Modern explanations frame bells as cultural artifacts, ritual objects, historical curiosities. And that framing is convenient, because once something is labeled symbolic, its removal no longer requires a justification. But the historical record tells a different story. Bells were once treated as infrastructure. Their placement was deliberate, their tuning was precise, their coverage overlapped. They formed networks, not electrical, not digital, acoustic, and acoustic systems are difficult to control. They need no fuel. They do not rely on centralized distribution. They do not belong to a corporation. They belong to a place, and that may be exactly why they were allowed to die, or encouraged to. Because a system that belongs to a place cannot be owned by anyone else. It needs no fuel you have to buy, no grid you have to connect to, no company you have to pay. It just rings, over a town, for free, the way it has for centuries, answerable to no one but the people who cast it. And that may also explain why modern science walked past the whole subject. The early 20th century did study resonance and vibration and environmental sound, but the study fragments almost as soon as it begins. What had been one holistic understanding gets broken into separate, unconnected fields. Sound becomes entertainment. Noise becomes an industrial byproduct to be regulated. Frequency becomes an abstraction on a chart. The idea that sound could structure an environment, or a body, or a community does not get disproven. It just gets divided into pieces small enough that no one is looking at the whole thing anymore, and then it is forgotten. That is not how a false idea dies, it is how a true one is buried. I am Julian Crane. When the bells were taken, something subtle but fundamental changed. Communities lost a shared rhythm, cities lost an invisible layer of order, the world grew louder and less coherent, and silence became normal. Today we stand in empty towers, we walk past sealed arches, we photograph the relics without ever asking why they were there in the first place. But once you see the pattern, it is difficult to unsee. The bells were not removed because they were outdated. They were removed because they belonged to a system that no longer fit the world being built, a world of centralized time, centralized power, and centralized sound, owned by someone, sold back to everyone. And that raises the final question, the one that keeps me up at night. If an entire layer of technology could be erased once, this thoroughly, this completely, and then reframed as mere superstition within a single generation, what else are we standing inside right now without realizing it? Because history does not always destroy what it replaces. Sometimes it just makes very sure we forget how it worked. I'll see you in the next one.